couple of weeks ago, the U.S. Senate approved a bill to provide $52 billion in U.S. subsidies for the semiconductor chip manufacturing industry in a bid to reach a compromise after months of discussions between the House and Senate, not to mention those who will benefit from said subsidies. As you all know by now, we've had a chip shortage for quite some time, a shortage that has all but stymied the manufacture of new cars. All vehicles use computer chips, gas-powered EV, fuel cells, so on and so forth. It's also disrupted the electronics industry as well. Unfortunately, all the good minerals are in all of the wrong countries. Today's guest is someone who will no doubt help alleviate our dependence on China. His chosen field of occupation is in mining tungsten or wolfram. It's a chemical element with the symbol W and atomic number 74, an exceptionally strong refractory metal of group 6 of the periodic table. I'm sure you all knew that. It's used in steels to increase hardness and strength, and in lamp filaments as well. Again, I'm sure you all knew that. Submitted for your approval, he is none other than Louis Black, CEO of Almonty Industries. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, a pleasure. Before we dig in, how did you become a miner? Was it something you just fell into serendipitously? Was it a family business, or see none of the above?
Well, I'd like to come up with a fantastic story that, I won it in a card game or something. But to be perfectly honest, it's quite much more geeky than that. I just became fascinated with actually tungsten, not mining per se, just tungsten, and that it's such a sort of alien metal and it's in everything. And ultimately, I sort of drifted there after college, and I worked in a place in Thailand where they had a mine, and so it evolved from that. And so I've dedicated, my career to the pursuit of mining tungsten in safe jurisdictions. So yes, I don't have a romantic story. I should really create one because it sounds so much better. But no, it was just a fascination with the metal.
Well, a Brit in Asia usually has some romantic overtones.
Well, yeah, it should involve a sort of white linen suit and a card game, I'm sure. But no, it's nothing that. And I was in Chiang Mai in the north of the country.
Okay.
This is in the middle of nowhere. But
Yeah.
no, it was just a fascination for the metal.
Fantastic.
So, Louis, I'm curious, is China your biggest competitor? And exactly when did you know that there was going to be a chip shortage of this nature and this magnitude?
Well, China produces 83% of the world's tungsten. So, and Russia produces the other sort of 7. So 90% of it comes from these two countries. So they are the ones that dictate who gets what. As for the chip shortage, we obviously provide the tungsten that's used in the tungsten gas, which is pumped into every semiconductor produced. And so we'd already seen from our customers last year that there was problems. And this was probably in the spring of last year. And then you started to see it more publicly become aware as car plants started to slow down and then shut. And then, of course, you didn't see it initially in the wider market because you had inventory on the dealership, forecourts. There was inventory. So it had less of an impact. But we were seeing it last spring that this was a problem. And ultimately, the industry was trying to look, how do we find a solution?
So is it purely their usage that allowed us or created the need for us to be so reliant on China for these semiconductors?
Well, no, semiconductors are produced predominantly in Taiwan and in South Korea. Those are the two biggest. Taiwan is the biggest producer by volume, and South Korea is the biggest by revenue of semiconductors. Semiconductor technology is at such a high technical level that really very few people can do it. I mean, China is many, many, many years behind from producing semiconductors that are used in everything. This is one of the problems that I think Taiwan feels. They have a lot of technology there that China could, find very useful. Well, except for the fact that you have to invade the country, but that's the whole thing a little fragile at the moment. But no,
let's hope that doesn't
technology is very limited in who actually has the ability to produce a semiconductor.
I got you. So tell me a little bit about the lobbying process on this bill. Is this, the mining industry and the auto industry and everybody coming together on lobbying for this bill, or how did that look?
Well, I mean, there is a push to a greener future. So that this is the sort of focus, I think, of government. And for instance, an EV uses roughly 2 times the number of semiconductors than a regular vehicle. So by this very push, you're actually, exacerbating the problem, because not only do you have shortages, you're increasing those shortages because you're pushing people into vehicles that need double the number. It's about 2,000 semiconductors per EV, thereabouts.
Wow.
I think also semiconductor is, as I said, technically very advanced. It's a very sexy thing to talk about because it's incredible. It's this tiny little thing that does so much. It's the brains of an EV. It's the brains. It's the brains of your laptop, of your TV, of your fridge. It's this tiny little wafer thing that is so important. And so for a politician, it's a really easy thing to talk about because everyone ultimately thinks they understand what a semiconductor is. So of course, I think the lobbying was more from government rather than in outside sources lobbying governments for this.
So this was
an easy
opportunity.
Yeah, they saw an opportunity to say, you know what, we're going to throw some money at this. But to put it in perspective, in South Korea, they announced, I think about 5 months ago, they were going to push over the next 10 years, 350 billion into increasing the, and this is industry, not government. The industry was going to put 350 billion to work to produce, to increase the capacity for semiconductor production. So 52 billion, it seems like a lot of money, but for these plants, it's not really going to move the needle.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
The question that everybody's asking, and this is probably the most important one, how many syllables are in the word semiconductor?
To be honest, I only have 10 fingers, so I couldn't tell you.
That's why politicians say it as much as they can. So I know the House asked for far more than the Senate was willing to give. So that 52 billion is just a compromise. Is it, and it's not even been passed yet, but do you think they're going to just pretty much stay at 52 billion or will it actually go up at all?
Well, the question is, what do they do with that 52 billion?
Yeah.
The United States traditionally was the big semiconductor producer. Back in the day, most of the semiconductors of the planet were being produced in the United States. It was another industry that sort of migrated away because the levels of investment required to stay at the cutting edge are vast. And there were other things to do in the United States. So like mining back in the day, 60s and 70s, the US was an extraordinarily dominant mining country in a democracy, no longer. So is this 52 billion is going to be used to attract Taiwanese, South Korean companies to open up in the United States? Is it going to develop an American-owned approach? I mean, it hasn't really been fully defined yet what the 52 billion is for. And so that's going to be interesting to see how that evolves.
Well, that was going to be my next question, and maybe it's less relevant now that you answered as you did, but let's talk about your company, Almonty Industries. How would this potential bill affect your business, and does a fair share conceivably go to procuring new land here or developing existing mines offshore? How does that work for you?
Well, I think, building a semiconductor factory is a fantastic idea. You've still got to feed it, though, with the raw materials.
Right.
And therein lies the problem. You have a shortage of raw materials right now. That's why commodity prices are extremely high. And you also have areas that these raw materials are produced in that perhaps you don't want to take any vacation time in. And so you're caught between a rock and a hard place. You want transparency of your supply chain. You want ESG to apply to where those raw materials come from. But right now, the only choice you have are from locations that aren't tremendously good. We're very fortunate. We've only ever worked in safe jurisdictions because that's what our customers have always demanded of us. And to be honest, I want to be able to sleep good at night. I don't want to be in a country where the president's son decides he wants to be in the tungsten business and I find a new door on the gate when I go into work. So it's important that transparency exists. But I think this is a long process. I don't think people should expect this to fix overnight.
Right. So you don't see any potential benefit for your own company at this point?
I think we benefit because there is a natural now migration away from the traditional sources of tungsten. So we are fielding much more inquiries from existing customers to increase our output, to develop new mines, which we're reopening now the world's largest tungsten mine in South Korea, because bizarrely, they actually consume more tungsten per capita than anywhere else in the world because of the semiconductor business. So it's a very good territory to be in. But North America, there are no mines, not in Canada, not in United States. And so we are now looking to develop a site in North America.
Okay, that's what my question was going to be. And real quickly, where would that be? Would that be like out in the Badlands of Nevada or Utah?
We're going to look where the best project is that we feel has the greatest longevity. We look at grade, longevity, location. Mining in the United States is not for the faint-hearted. That's for sure. But we, it's Canada or the United States. These are the two territories that we will look at.
So, Louis, I was actually going to ask, how long would it be for a favorable impact to be felt in the automotive industry, from this bill being passed? And you answered that's not going to happen right away. That's not going to be a quick thing at all. So I defer the question to what impact do you think the passing of this bill and China knowing that our attention is now on miners like you gathering this raw material, what do you think the impact is going to be on their process now? Do you think that they're going to try and ramp it up knowing that we're doing the same? Or how will that look, do you think?
They've spent 30 years developing an extraordinarily efficient supply chain, domestic supply chain in China. I mean, they are extremely good operators of their mines. They've really put it well together because ultimately they're not handicapped by the regulations. Opening a mine in a democracy is, as I said, not for the faint-hearted. It is a process. Yeah. There's a reason why mines, raw materials thrive in countries with perhaps less transparency. It's a simpler thing to say, build it there. Okay. And the people living on the site, well, we'll just move them. So it's a little more, it's much more complex than I think people understand. What China ultimately is going to do, who knows? But they are for sure going to try and protect their market share. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that they're not going to say, oh, well, now you guys have just woken up to the fact that, we have almost a virtual monopoly on these things. Sure, we'll let you have a piece.
Yeah.
Because would a US company do the same? I mean, if someone came, you think that Tesla isn't going to defend their corner in EVs, or Apple's not going to defend their corner in smartphones. I mean, it's normal. China has, 1 foot in the free market, 1 foot in their market. But they're not going to give up market share like that. And really, traditionally, how they've always counted market share was price. In the 80s, there was supply chains in democracies. The end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, there was virtually none because China arrived and they brought material very cheaply. And that ultimately goes to the root of the problem that we'll all face, is that we all want to diversify, we all want choice, but if someone offers it to us at a great price, we're like, we'll do it next week.
Yeah.
Well, you're talking.
And they know this.
You're talking. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lewis.
No, so Kelly, China knows this. They know that we're weak in that sense. We kind of we fold that easily, because we can't say no to a deal.
Yeah.
So it is what it is.
It is true. I've manufactured in China, and I can vouch for that 100%. We're looking at plastic injection molding here, and they just couldn't compete, nor could they compete with the microchips that we needed to use in China as well. But you have to be there because they have a screw Western Civilization 101 is the first course they teach in elementary school. So you have to know how they do business, and it's pretty crazy. I've been there a couple times. So let's talk about the fun stuff, and that would be mining in the United States. And there needs to be a political will, but I would assume that there also has to be environmental impact studies that need to be handled, and that's got to take some time as well. Do they have the testosterone across both sides of the aisle politically here in the United States to actually start doing this here in the US? What's your take on that?
No, I don't believe it's going to really be feasible for either side, to really get behind this, because ultimately neither of their bases are pro-mining. Mines had their day, and they're now seen as a very 19th century kind of throwback to history. There is no appetite to now push domestic mining. Yes, there's regulations. Yes, this is normal in every democracy, but they don't want it in their backyard. I read this thing the other day about wind farms off Cape Cod, that you have an enclave of people who are very environmentally active, and yet they don't want to look at the wind farms.
Yeah.
So it's because apparently, according to the Kennedys who were there, it's difficult to land your plane with a wind farm, apparently, which I suppose is one rationale. But ultimately, I think that really sums it up. there are some communities still in the Appalachians and some communities that are pro mining, but it's not on a national level. And I think that what we're looking at, there's a bill going through now called the REE Shore Act, where it classifies, say, tungsten as a rare earth. And they're basically saying that if you're in the defense contractor business in the US, you can't use Chinese sourced rare earths. And that includes manganese, lithium, tungsten, and then all the rare earths, the 17 of them that I can't even pronounce, the yttrium and the niobium and so on. But it also talks about stockpiling commodities, strategic minerals, and government offtakes. And I think that's the direction they're going to go. They're going to basically say, look, you know, you got to build it where we can see transparency, but we're not going to say you should build it here. We're just going to say, here is a government contract. If you meet these conditions of ESG, we'll buy from you. And I think that's probably the most creative approach they can take.
Yeah.
So Louis, a little bit lighter of a question. How much earth do you have to move to get enough tungsten to make, let's just say, one semiconductor? And I know you've already mentioned they're very, very small.
Well, I mean, to be honest, not a huge amount, because we use, you know, the tungsten that's used in a semiconductor is crushed down to a nano size fraction, which is then injected into a gas, because you can't smelt a tungsten. And then the gas is pumped into each semiconductor that coat on a microscopic level a coating of tungsten, because one, it's very conductive, and secondly, it dissipates heat. So you don't have to worry about, you know, cobalt in anodes, they combust, you know, a battery can go up and it burns, what, 48 hours. You put tungsten on that same anode, it'll get as hot as the sun and it won't smell. Well, the temperature of the sun, it will smelt tungsten, but it's non-combustible. So
very hot.
It can take the heat. So you don't need a huge, I mean, the entire planet, we only produce about 90,000 tons a year of tungsten. That's it. So it's very dense, same density as gold, but we don't mine, we don't move a lot of earth.
I got you.
Comparative. So
when a mine is kind of fished out, so to speak, is there a reclamation process that you guys do around the globe? I know you have mines elsewhere. I would assume that process would be different in the United States due to our regulation. Can you elaborate on that?
You're working in a democracy. That's all pretty much the same.
Oh, is it?
Thing. Yeah. It's you know, you have certain, you know, different, like in Canada, for instance, now you have First Nations as well that have to be consulted. In Australia, you have the Indigenous Aboriginal people. So you have these additional layers, but ultimately in terms of reclamation, environmental compliance, the international standards are just that now. They're pretty much across the board. I think the main difference in the US is that even if you comply to all of the regulations and all the law that exists, you can still run into trouble if the political will is against you. So there's the legal framework in the United States. There's also the emotional framework, and that can also impact you. So that's something to also consider in the US.
Yeah. So which has more impact on the land? Is it oil drilling, strip mining? What has more impact on the land? What type of
strip mining?
Strip mining.
Strip mining. I mean, you know, drilling for oil is you're drilling. It's a hole, and they cap the hole after you finished, and that's the end of it. When you strip mine, I mean, we hard rock mine and we strip mine. The strip mine, you have to, when you finish, you have to fill in the hole. It's a big hole, but in that time where the hole exists, it's very visible. The mine in South Korea is underground, and we've developed systems where we put all of our waste and all of our tailings back underground, so that there will be no evidence that we're there, and that's the future. But strip mining it has a lot more of an impact environmentally, well, optically, environmentally.
Yeah, so that's a big nay. So I for one am in full favor of the bill. I'd like to see it actually increased. The amount of money that we put towards some of the most absurd things just defies logic. Our dependence on China is ridiculous. It's costing jobs. It's blowing up prices left and right. And if we have the ability to eat more of the semiconductor pie, we may as well open our mouths. That's the way I look at it, though. So,
I mean, the United States is the big consumer of semiconductors. I mean, it's a classic example of how globalization has put everyone sort of, you know, in a precarious position. The US consumes more semiconductors than anybody else, and yet you really don't produce any semiconductors. That doesn't really make an awful lot of sense, but then you can say that about many, many industries. I mean, the car sector in the Europe right now, they have problems with wiring looms. They have companies that make the wiring looms and then ship them to the car plants to be installed. They have problems because over the years they've been pushing that, subcontracting that out further and further east because they've been following the cheap labor. And they're now done by Ukraine. Of course, now Ukraine is rather busy to be making looms for Volkswagens. Yeah. So, you have car plants that are sitting idle because there's no other, they don't have anyone else right away that can now replicate that job. So I think this is probably a good wake-up call to say, you know what, globalization is a wonderful idea, but you've got to remember sometimes chasing the cheap route can cost you a lot more in the long run.
With this lesson that we've learned, do you believe that there will be another situation like this 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or do you think the United States is waking up to being able to produce what we need here at home?
I think they were, in the previous administration, they were talking about it. Now the current administration is talking about it, but at the moment, there's still not an awful lot that's been done. They're sort of making, slow progress. But unfortunately, the nature of democracies is that if you can't do it in an election cycle, it probably won't get done. So, the problem is that the direction of the previous administration was much more focused to solely be domestic, which regardless of whether the project was good or not, we're going to just do it because it's here, which is really not a great idea because ultimately that means constant government subsidy to support it. I'm talking mines here. The new administration, its base is not going to support mines, so it's looking for other alternatives. I think the industry itself is going to have to drive this. I think the Teslas of the world are going to say, you know what, we're going to buy our tungsten, but we want to know that it has transparency. And that's, I think industry is going to find the solution. It's amazing when you think you can make a living by complying to what your customers want. And then you can get creative and you can find jurisdictions that tick the boxes.
Yeah. That makes sense.
And capital is another thing. In China, for instance, there is an endless amount of state subsidies or state loans to develop supply chain. We don't have that opportunity right now. So industry has to be the one that really pushes this. And I think ultimately they will.
Yeah. As a country have been known to go into other countries for their resources. In fact, that's more than likely why we went into Afghanistan. So now that you mentioned that Taiwan and South Korea are at risk because they do so well with semiconductor manufacturing in such a way of the future that perhaps that's where we should put some of our more intense strategic military attention.
Well, South Korea, I think, is safe. Kelly, I think South Korea is not there's already 50,000 US troops there, and they have they're like the 51st state. I mean, they really are. Because Taiwan, I think, is, I think it's a very precarious situation. I think maybe, people look at the response to Ukraine and think, you know what, that's not so bad. Maybe we'll just, while we've got the opportunity, there's an awful lot in Taiwan we like. So I think that sort of, makes me a little nervous about what's going to happen there.
I agree 100%, but they've also failed miserably so far in Ukraine. And I think Taiwan is watching this and they're more than prepared for anything that could possibly happen. But it's an interesting mark. And I want to thank you so much for joining us. I think that elucidated quite a bit of the questions that I think people had out there. Is there anything else that you'd like to add about the company?
Well, I'd just like to say, my bold prediction is that by the end of Q4 of 23, I think you're going to see the whole semiconductor business start to stabilize.
That's good news. So
yeah, that is good news.
When do you think automotive interests will start seeing some new deliveries? Maybe 2020, late 2023, 2024?
I would say you'll start to see some normalization after the summer of next year. I think that's when you're going to start seeing it settle down a little bit.
Fingers crossed. Again, Louis Black of Almonty Industries, thanks for joining us. For all of you who have joined us as well, have a great day.